Hello, one of my favorite films is The Death of Stalin. If you haven't seen it, I recommend watching it this weekend. It condenses the months-long power struggle between Khrushchev and Beria into just a few days of dramatized chaos. The movie shows Khrushchev's rise to power, starting out as something of a fool. He pretends to be a buffoon for a while, then seizes the moment when Beria lets his guard down. It's the story of how the fool ends up taking control. All of this unfolds after Stalin's death. The film captures that tense moment in a darkly comedic way. There's a line in the film that stuck with me. This is a game where one wrong word, and you're dead. That's exactly how it's said. It's a line from Khrushchev in the movie, and it captures the film's core message, how truth gets distorted just to survive. It's all a game of lies, really, especially under communism. It wasn't just the ordinary people who were oppressed. The higher up you were in power, the more oppressive it got. Their thoughts, words, and even actions were all under tight control. So they all became skilled at playing the lying game. But whether it was true or not, that didn't matter at all. Even a lie, if it was consistent, was accepted as truth. But even the truth, if you stumbled through it, and it didn't add up, you could be executed, or sent straight to a labor camp. That's how brutal the logic was. Khrushchev, being well-versed in that game, knows how to persuade people. In the film, he persuades Stalin's daughter. But it shows his underlying philosophy. It's not important whether you're telling the truth. If your story doesn't line up, you die. That's the harsh reality. When I discovered Bitcoin, it reminded me of this idea. Of course, we're not literally talking about life or death here. It's not as brutal as that kind of game. But in a way, we should treat it that seriously. Because in the intellectual arena, it is ruthless. In intellectual discourse, there's no room for sloppy arguments. Take Ripple, for example, or Bitcoin. There are people making logically inconsistent claims, and they're misunderstanding something fundamental. Yes, international money transfers do face barriers. It's inconvenient, right? So Ripple, the company, has been trying, in its own way, to build an international exchange system and offer it as a payment tool. They've been pitching this as their business model. That's the Ripple I'm referring to. As for investing in XRP, I won't say anything definitive. Some of you might have lost money on it, or maybe it's gone back up. I'm not in a position to say for sure. I'm no prophet after all, but I can examine the logic behind the claim. Is the claim even logically coherent? Let's take what we call the Bretton Woods system. It began in 1944 when global leaders gathered at a U.S. resort and signed a financial agreement. That framework has carried on to this day. Sure, the structure has evolved, but there's no better term for it, even if economists say it ended long ago. In international politics, we still call it the Bretton Woods system. So, is the inconvenience in global transfers a tech problem? No, it's not. You need to understand that. They made international transfers inconvenient on purpose. If you think tech can easily solve that, you're making a big mistake. And because I understand that when it comes to CBDCs, I might sound cynical when I say it's all just a show. But yeah, it really is just a show. And if they do launch, they'll come under some odd branding. There's retail CBDC. Even the IMF reports are using the term retail. That means a CBDC the general public can use, which is different from a CBDC used only between central banks. They made up the term retail CBDC to draw that distinction. But even if a CBDC does come out, it won't be retail. You need to study this carefully. You should understand what's really going on. If what I'm saying right now comes as a shock to you, or if it makes you feel defensive, then I'm confident you haven't studied this enough. That much I'm sure of. It means you lack the background knowledge. If you've studied basic macroeconomics, then study this material. I read through this paper yesterday, and it's well organized and informative. The Bretton Woods system was shaped by three main figures. One was Keynes, the British representative, and another was his American counterpart, Dexter White from the U.S. State Department. The third was President Roosevelt. He was the U.S. president who led the Allies to victory in World War II. People often view Roosevelt as a traditional American liberal president, but that's the wrong way to see him. He took power after the Great Depression, and one of the first things he did was ban U.S. citizens from owning gold and force them to sell it to the government at a low price. So from the very beginning of his presidency, you could see exactly what Roosevelt thought about gold. Before the end of World War II, Roosevelt made it clear that in the post-war order, what mattered more than financial balance was the policy autonomy of each nation. That, he said, should be the priority. So he had no interest in a global currency or in going back to a gold standard. In fact, when it came to that, he had strong opposition to it. And Keynes, of course, was no exception. Both believed the bureaucratic elite should govern the public and the market. These were the people who designed the system. Now, people say the system is outdated. We're stuck with clunky tools like Swift codes, so we should replace it with Ripple. But is it really due to a lack of tech? No, it's intentional. That's why one of the key terms in this paper is capital control. It means capital must be controlled. And in order to control capital, they have to limit individuals and companies from moving capital across borders. That's how they believe national monetary sovereignty is preserved. Where did this idea come from? In the period between the two world wars, many countries returned to the gold standard Take the British pound, for instance. During World War I, they had to finance the war, so they temporarily left the gold standard. Later, they returned to it, thinking they needed to restore sound money under pressure from academics, or for other reasons. But this return to the gold standard ended up wrecking the global financial system. Austrians interpret that history differently, of course, but in mainstream economics, the deflation and depression between the two wars are seen as the direct pathway to World War II and the rise of fascism. That period between the two wars, the financial chaos of that era, is captured in the book Lords of Finance. The book takes a thoroughly Keynesian perspective, depicting the financial chaos between the two world wars. Its main thesis, in short, had the world followed Keynes, World War II could have been avoided. But during the interwar years after World War I ended, the Great Depression hit and fascism rose. The book argues that's because no one listened to Keynes. That's the story, told from a Keynesian lens. But here's what really matters. When the Bretton Woods system was being designed in 1944, the victors, the elite policymakers, held these exact ideas in their minds. That's key. In other words, if we had a global currency, a crisis in one region would spread globally. Because gold is inherently deflationary, governments can't respond flexibly, leading to depression. Gold also fuels competition between nations to hoard it. That's called mercantilism in economics. So naturally, protectionism flares up. Countries build walls around their economies, focused only on exports to accumulate gold while trying to avoid imports altogether. So protectionism, deflation, and contagion, all of them, in this view, stem from gold. And also from the very idea of a global currency. So in response to all this, they put up barriers, strict compartments. If there are 200 countries in the world, there are now 200 financial compartments. And it's not because technology is lacking. So the post-1944 global system has actively suppressed the idea of a global currency and replaced it with institutions like the IMF, a multitude of global organizations, and the G7, which are unofficial but function like official summits of global leadership. You have regular meetings of central bankers and finance ministers. All of these together make up a patchwork system, stitched together. It's a fragmented, absurd framework that somehow we're still maintaining. To see how absurd it is, just look at when it was created. Dexter White, the U.S. representative, and Keynes. They argued over a key issue. They both agreed to move away from the gold standard. And the benefit of doing so was this. A country could run a trade deficit for a while. Gold normally self-adjusts that imbalance. So, under a new system, they could allow longer deficits and be more flexible and lenient. But they still needed a limit, a cap on those deficits. Something like a gentleman's agreement. Since Britain was running trade deficits, Keynes argued, let's allow up to $20 billion in deficits. That way they could continue running deficits, without needing to overhaul their policies overnight. He wanted that kind of breathing room. But the U.S. never imagined it would run a trade deficit, so they insisted on minimizing the limit. They proposed a cap of just $2 billion. That's a tenfold difference. And that became a major point of contention. There were 2 or 3 other things they negotiated on, but this was the most absurd and ironic of them all. Even the architects of this system, Keynes and Dexter White, never imagined the U.S. would someday run persistent trade deficits, but within just 10 years that assumption fell apart. The U.S. became the exception. They had no choice but to break the very rules they helped create. That's the thing about human-made systems. They evolve into something totally different from how they were designed. These rules aren't handed down from the heavens, locked in place forever. They're etched into a foundation made of people of politics, so they shift over time. And when the pillar supporting that order shakes, you have to make exceptions. These aren't divine decrees. We're not refereeing from heaven. A referee appointed by FIFA officiates the match. And if FIFA has no stake in the game, the referee can be fair. But if FIFA's survival depends on the outcome, fairness becomes impossible, because their own survival is on the line. It's the same with global monetary systems. So had the U.S. followed Keynes's advice, allowing up to $20 billion in trade deficits, it could have run the system with less backlash. But America itself couldn't stick to the rule. So the rules kept changing. Eventually, it led to the suspension of gold convertibility. In short, at the end of World War II, the world was dominated by ideas of idealism. Communism itself is an idealistic vision. So there was this spirit of idealism. And under that influence, they believed that granting each nation full sovereignty would free them from the constraints of gold, rigid and unyielding as it is, and build a more flexible system. A system where government, on behalf of their people, could manage monetary policy with greater flexibility and exercise sovereignty. That was the vision shared by Roosevelt, Dexter White, and Keynes. But what did we get in reality? The people ended up in the hands of actual economic thugs. Even in an imperial system, an empire can't bully all its people indiscriminately. It has to govern with rule and order. That's the very essence of empire, rule and order. The larger the empire, the more it must rely on law. to allow individuals room to breathe. But now we have 200 mini-states acting like local gangsters, where elites fleece their own citizens. And that's now normalized. But now, the tides may be turning. So even if it's not Ripple's intention, if it's blockchain, replaces SWIFT codes and enables smooth transfers between banks, making the system more fluid. And one day governments are forced to accept it, because it becomes a kind of tomahawk power. Okay, that's a possibility, but is that moment already here? I'm not so sure. Reading things like this, these heavy, serious books, leads me, Taman, to one conclusion. In the end, it's Bitcoin. And why is Bitcoin a kind of art? Because the forces trying to maintain the current system are enormous. Right now, the mainstream powers dominate, because of sheer inertia. It's not about whether the system is convenient or not. So much is built upon this system. Jobs, interests, and livelihoods all depend on it. That's why they're so determined to preserve it. So is it really, as Ripple hopes, more efficient and more convenient? Why don't we just adopt it? Things don't change that way. So what does it take? It has to be like Bitcoin a hammer. It has to smash the existing structure. Then decent, passionate people, watching what's happening in places like Kabul or Afghanistan. I'm talking about the bureaucrats here. They start to realize, wow, Bitcoin can actually be used that way, and that it can't be stopped. If they study a bit, like U.S. prosecutor Catherine Hahn did, they'll realize you can't indict Bitcoin. You can't put Bitcoin on trial. You can't ban Bitcoin. There's simply no one to drag into court. There's no defendant. Once they realize this, they'll choose to coexist. While preserving their own system, the only viable form of coexistence will end up being Bitcoin. Everything else is just too idealistic. That's why CBDCs are a complete fantasy for idealists. If they really wanted CBDCs, they would have launched them before blockchain. We've had internet-based digital tech for ages. If a government had done what e-gold did, that's basically a CBDC. Only difference is it was private. If they really meant to do it, they could have banned private versions and launched a government-run e-gold system, backed by gold, linked to each national currency, and connected through a network, acting as a bridge. That's not technically difficult. The only question is, who runs the server? One entity or many? If that's the issue, it's solvable. Why not let multiple central banks share the server? Isn't that what blockchain is? So you really need to think things through logically and consistently.